What is this man holding? These are Roman death masks, hyper-realistic impressions taken from a deceased person's face. While they may seem a little creepy to us, they were a feature of ancestor veneration in ancient Rome, for those who could afford it. So the question is, what did Roman ancestor veneration look like? Welcome to Hearth of Hymonia. My name is Kate, and today we are continuing our spooky season content for the month of October. This is my second spooky video. If you missed last week's video on werewolves, I will have a link to it in the description. But today we are talking about how the ancient Romans conceptualized what happens after death and the relationship that they had with their ancestors. I wanted to include this topic in my spooky season lineup for a couple of reasons. First is that I'm going to be talking about encounters with malevolent spirits next week, specifically ghost sightings and hauntings. So I thought that this would be a good video to have as background information on the way that life after death was conceptualized in ancient Rome, and also as a way to cover the not malevolent spirits of antiquity. And the second reason is because a lot of cultures around the world celebrate and honor their ancestors at this time of year, with holidays like Dia de los Muertos and All Souls Day, and spiritual traditions that acknowledge some kind of energetic shift that happens at this time of year. A lot of times it's referred to as the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead thinning, in other words, making communication and physical travel or energetic travel between planes much easier. Now, just a little bit of a disclaimer, although many cultures around the world do acknowledge this time of year as a time to connect with your ancestors and with spirits of all kinds, the Romans did not necessarily venerate their ancestors in the month of October or at this time of year in general. Their main ancestral holidays, which we'll get into in the video, happened in the month of February. But since we tend to be thinking about these kinds of things now, I wanted to put this video out this month. In order to understand Roman ancestor veneration, we first need to understand how the Romans thought about death and the customs that they had around death, burial, and remembrance. This is going to be a general introduction to this topic. I do hope to revisit this in more detail because Roman funerary customs are super complicated. We have a lot of information about them, but for now I'm just going to give a general overview of what that looked like. The Romans were much closer to death than we are today. What I mean by that is that they saw death up close and personal far more often than we do in the modern world. They had cutting-edge medical technology for their time, but it was still, of course, not as advanced as we have today. So people would die from things that are totally treatable today, things like tuberculosis, for which we have a vaccine, or an infection from a minor wound. These things could kill a person in antiquity and often did, particularly for those who didn't have access to resources the way that others did. So in other words, those who were poor, those who lived in the country, etc., etc. Not to mention the ever-present looming possibility of war, which was not only far more common in those times, but also could be far more brutal in a sense, and the danger of childbirth. I mean, childbirth is still dangerous today, so you can imagine the danger that it posed in antiquity. Just to give you some statistics about what life expectancy was like in the ancient world, the average life expectancy in the Roman period was about 25 years old. Now that doesn't mean that everyone died at the age of 25, it just means that if you count infant deaths, childhood deaths, deaths of women in childbirth and of men in war, the number of people that lived to old age was actually quite small. So that's why the life expectancy is really low. Of children born, only half would expect to live beyond the age of 10 years old. And then for women, 1 in 50 likely died in childbirth. And all of these statistics are, of course, under normal circumstances. I think now more than ever we can understand what life would have been like during periods of widespread plague. The Antonine Plague may have killed up to 10% of the population of the Roman Empire at the time, and the Plague of Justinian, which took place a few centuries later, may have killed up to a quarter. Because death was so close, the Romans thought about it maybe more than we do on the average today. Another thing that we need to understand is that death oftentimes happened in the home. Rome didn't have hospitals and hospice centers the way that we do today. Most people in modern America will die in a facility like this. But in ancient Rome, the only places like this, called valetudinaria, were military field hospitals or, on occasion, hospitals set up to care for sick and injured slaves. The average Roman might get medical care from a doctor who made house calls or who had a very small private practice but didn't have inpatient services. And by the way, this is how it was for most of human history. In most cases, people would die at home surrounded by their loved ones. Loved ones also took care of most of the funeral preparations when a person died. Now, not everybody was afforded the same funeral. Some people, most people, couldn't afford a full funeral at all. Oftentimes, slaves and criminals who had committed certain offenses weren't buried at all, a fact that I will come back to in a minute because it's significant in a particular way. And those who couldn't afford a funeral for their loved ones may simply have just put their body out of the house onto the street. In fact, it was illegal to dump a body outside of your house in ancient Rome. Again, the Romans were much closer to death than we are today. When was the last time your neighbor put a body out on the sidewalk? Now, most people were cremated, and this is true throughout Roman history until we get into the later parts of the empire when people start to be inhumed. Because of this, embalming was not a common practice. The body would have been cleaned, anointed with certain oils, and then dressed appropriately for how the person was in life. For those who did have funerals, the family were responsible for covering the costs, except in the case of, say, prominent military commanders, lifelong politicians, obviously the emperor and the imperial family. Those types of people would have had a state funeral that was paid for by the state. The image that I showed at the beginning of this video displays a particular custom of Roman ancestor veneration and funeral preparation. The images that the man is holding, called imagenes, right, very easy to remember, were hyper-realistic impressions of a deceased person's face. They're made by taking an impression of the deceased person's face and casting a mask or statue or of some kind from that impression. Sometimes people may have done this while the person was alive as well, just to make it a little bit easier. Now, as you can imagine, this is a very expensive project, so not everybody had these. These would have been an exclusive kind of thing. And at first glance, it may feel a little unusual to take a realistic impression of the person's face at the time of their death. It may seem almost creepy to us, but if you think about it, the Romans didn't have photographs. They may have been able to commission paintings and pictures of their loved ones, or maybe even statues, and Roman statues are known for being realistic in the first place, but they didn't have anything that really truly was an exact image of their loved ones. So in a way, you can understand how this type of thing might develop. Now, once a family had the imagenes of their loved ones, they would display them prominently in their home and take them out on certain occasions, like holidays that celebrated the ancestors and family events like weddings and other funerals. It was a way of including your ancestors in the goings-on of your life. Even though they've passed on, they are still with you in this way. Now that's a brief overview of Roman funerary practices. Obviously there's quite a bit more to say about these, but I want to turn now to what happens after you die. The Romans, as most cultures do, believed in an afterlife. Their afterlife very closely resembled the Greek and Etruscan afterlife. They believed that when you die, the god Mercury, who in Greece was called Hermes, would guide your soul down to a place called the underworld. This underworld was accessed by crossing a body of water. The Greeks had the river Styx, and the Romans referred to a lake that they called Acheron, and you had to cross this body of water to get to the afterlife. The way that you cross this body of water is in a boat led by a deity called Charon, who demanded payment in the form of coins. This is why in Greek funerals, coins were left on the eyes of the deceased, and in Roman funerals, a single coin was put inside the mouth. If you didn't have this fee to cross over whichever body of water to get into the underworld, then you couldn't enter that afterlife. You couldn't rest in peace. The underworld was ruled by Pluto and Proserpina and was divided into sections. Now, as Christianity develops its concept of heaven and hell and purgatory throughout the late antique and medieval periods, they undoubtedly used the Greco-Roman and Etruscan underworld structure as a sort of a guide. I'm almost certain of that. If you were an exceptionally bad person in life, you would go to the eternal torment section. This is where people like Sisyphus and Tantalus were doomed to spend eternity in punishment for their actions that they committed when they were alive. There was also a place for exceptionally good people. Usually these were military heroes and emperors. The Romans highly valued military endeavors and, of course, thought very highly of their emperors, or officially thought very highly of their emperors. So the exceptionally good place was reserved for those guys. But most everybody else could expect to go to the regular person place, which was neither good nor bad, just was. Now, all of this depended on a proper burial. I mentioned that without the coin, you can't cross the body of water, the river Styx, or the Lake of Acheron. But beyond the coin, the funeral itself was a religious ritual that ensured that the deceased would have a proper afterlife. No proper burial, no resting in peace. And this is why when you see someone be denied a proper burial, someone like a criminal who had committed a particular offense, or in some cases, in times of civil war, your rivals, right, might be denied a proper burial. This was a level of disrespect that extended beyond life itself. Not only were they denying you a customary ritual that was of cultural significance to the living, but it also, if you believe in an afterlife, if you believe that funeral rites are the key to getting to a proper afterlife, denying burial to someone means denying them the ability to rest in peace and dooming them to walk the earth eternally as the restless, tormented dead. This is a very, very serious punishment. So whenever you see someone be denied a proper burial, or you see it mentioned that a person was not given a proper funeral, this is an indication of a very, very serious level of disrespect. Now, assuming that you carried out the funeral properly, you can rest assured that your loved ones will reach the afterlife as they are supposed to. But just because a soul is in the underworld doesn't mean that they're necessarily gone forever. Just like how today a lot of people point to signs from their ancestors, things like seeing certain kinds of birds or butterflies, maybe images in clouds, and they take these as signals that their ancestors are watching over them and protecting them. Many Romans, I would argue probably most Romans, believed that their ancestors could communicate with them in some form or another. This was a topic of hot debate among the literary class. Now, I don't have time to dig through all the philosophical schools and present a complete argument of how they saw the immortality or not immortality of the soul. Maybe someday, maybe I'll start digging into the weeds of ancient philosophy, but today is not that day. Suffice it to say that the less religious philosophical traditions, those who maybe weren't sure what the nature of the gods were, or if there were even gods at all, tended to say that the soul was not immortal, and that when you die, that's kind of it. And then there's a million other theories about what the soul might actually face if they come from a philosophical tradition that accepts the potential for an immortal soul. But those are just the philosophers. Most Romans were not philosophers. Most Romans followed the state religion. The state religion, with its tales about the underworld and its proper funeral customs, would have promoted the idea of an afterlife. So most Romans, I would argue, believed in that afterlife. And if you believe in an afterlife, then you believe that a person can, in one way or another, exist after their physical death. Honoring the dead, whether you believed that they can interact with you or not, was a practice observed by most Romans of all circumstances. Rome was a traditional society, meaning that they tended to carry on the lifestyles, beliefs, and practices of those who came before them. This was officially called the mos maiorum, or the custom of the ancestors, maybe even the custom of those who are greater than you. And so the ancestors were honored and venerated on all levels. Most Romans would have honored their ancestors on a daily basis simply by carrying on their legacy, by living the way that they had lived, by telling stories about them to their children, by remembering them in official capacities, and simply just by following in their footsteps. On the religious side of things, there were a couple of festivals that honored the ancestors, and they all took place in February. Although they had different names, it's probably better to think of them as one big festival, the way that we think of maybe Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. They have different names, but they're kind of the same thing, just different stages of observance. The Feast of Parentalia took place in early February, beginning on February 13th, and it lasted for 9 consecutive days. As the name implies, this was the time to honor one's parents and, by extension, all of one's ancestors. Opening ceremonies of the Parentalia were carried out by the Vestals, making a connection between the home and the state. Most of the festivities of the Parentalia took place at home, but the state participated by closing all of the temples and shutting down all public business. In other words, no public worship could take place of other gods. You couldn't conduct government business or official business. Shops had to close down, and weddings were forbidden at this time. The shutting down of official business, marriages, worship in the temples, this was all because the Parentalia was considered a time of official mourning. Doesn't necessarily have to be sad, but it is an official time to remember the dead, and therefore all other business must stop. The last day of Parentalia was called the Feralia because offerings were carried from the verb fero to the dead. How do I know this? Ovid's Fasti! Once again, we are bringing Ovid onto this channel every single week. Ovid, as you can imagine, who talks about all the Roman holidays, talks about the Feralia, and this is what he says about the customs of that day. There is honor also for tombs. Appease your ancestors' spirits and bring small offerings to their extinguished pyres. The shades seek small things. Piety is pleasing instead of costly gifts. Styx below has no greedy gods. A tile is enough, covered with garlands spread over it, fruits of the earth sprinkled over it, a little pinch of salt, Ceres' grain softened in wine, and loose violets. Let a tile hold these, left in the middle of the road. I'm not opposed to bigger offerings, but the shades are pleased even by these small tokens. Add prayers and appropriate words over the hearths you've set up. Aeneas, a fitting originator of piety, brought this custom to your lands, just Latinus. He brought sacred gifts to the spirit of his father, and from here the people learned the pious rites. Now, Ovid goes on to talk about what happened when one time the Romans ignored the rites of Parentalia, but I'm going to come back to that next week. If you don't want to miss it, you can subscribe to my channel. On the day after the Feralia, there was another festival called the Caristia, named for one's dear ones. Carus means dear in Latin. On this day, family gathers together, they share a meal and enjoy each other's company. They also make offerings to the household gods, the Lares, and they toast to the health of the emperor. At least that's what Ovid tells us, because he's writing during the imperial period. Ovid says that this feast is a welcome reprieve from all of the mourning that takes place during the Parentalia and the Feralia, and that spending time with the dead makes spending time with the living much sweeter. You appreciate your living relatives more because you know that someday they will be gone. The inclusion of the toast to the emperor, I would imagine, has to do again with the connection between the family and the state, something that is very important to Roman religion, and which I cover in my discussion of the Vestals, which I will also link down below. And that's the basic outline of Roman ancestor veneration. Do you celebrate your ancestors at this time of year? For me, I like to eat foods that my grandparents enjoyed because it's very different from the diet that I currently have, and I often spend time meditating and remembering them, reminiscing about the good times. And actually this year I've been playing cards a lot more lately, which is something that I always did with my grandmother. Let me know in the comments below how you connect with your ancestors during this time when the veil is thin. If you like this video, you can let me know by clicking the thumbs up button, and if you want to see more content like this, you can go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Spooky season continues for a few more weeks, and I'll be back next week to continue our discussion of spirits. On the malevolent side of things, I'll be telling some funky ghost stories and weird hauntings, so stay tuned for that. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you next time.